Every day, thousands of people come from all over the world to see the most famous tourist attraction in New York and one of the most important on the globe, Times Square. They come to this tourist spot for many reasons: to see the lights on its infinite shining billboards, to watch a musical in one of the Broadway theaters, to shop at the many stores, or just to feel the pulsing energy of the place, surrounded by excited people from many different cultures. According to the Times Square Alliance, there are no official numbers of how many people visit Times Square, but the estimate is that 37 million people per year come to this tourist spot. That's over 200% more than 30 years ago, in 1980. The money spent here contributes with $1.1 billion a year in taxes to New York City and with $1.3 billion a year in taxes to the state of New York. What do you like about Times Square?
It's just so bright and so much movement. I just can't believe it. And just the people, it's a whole buzz.
All these lights and all people are here, so it's very fun as a place for New York. I love this.
It's beautiful and the foreign people.
It's very, very busy and there's a whole lot to look at. Love it.
People, different countries, and the lights, the theaters.
But what people that visit Times Square today may not know is that Times Square has been transformed. In fact, many times. To look at the history of Times Square, we have to go back more than 100 years ago.
I'm in a New York state of mind.
The construction around 42nd Street began in 1899. Quickly after, this area of town became a famous entertainment place for its big concentration of theaters. In 1904, the New York Times constructed a building on 42nd Street. In honor of the Times Tower, people began to call the square in front of the building Times Square. During its golden age, Times Square was the place where people would gather for big events. At the end of World War II, hundreds of thousands of people celebrated the VG Day in Times Square after the victory over Japan. Sidney Baumgarten, one of those responsible for the renewal of Times Square, remembered how the place was in its early years.
It was always central to the entertainment in New York, having all the Broadway theaters and the movies and everything else. And I remember as a kid coming into Manhattan to go to the Paramount Theater when Frank Sinatra first appeared there.
I want to be a part of it. New York, New York.
But the glamour didn't last. With the closing of almost all Broadway theaters after an economic recession, the degradation of Times Square began.
There were dozens upon dozens of sex establishments, and I include in that not only pornographic bookstores, topless bars, houses of prostitution, and a variety of places like that. It got so bad during the 60s and the early 70s that you virtually could not walk down the street on 42nd Street and 8th Avenue in that area without being accosted or almost forced off the sidewalk by the large numbers of hookers and pimps and everybody else that were in the area. There were a lot of homicides that took place in connection with the sex industry. Hookers who were killed by their pimps for one reason or another. There was a lot of violence against Johns who picked up the hookers. A lot of them were tourists.
Mr. Baumgarten was the director of the Midtown Enforcement Project, the first effort to clean and renew Times Square. What measures did you take?
They began to draft a law. We had very inadequate legislation to deal with these problems. So I called in the police commanders in Midtown and I said, look, I want you to map on a map where all the serious crimes are committed in your precinct. Murder, rape, robbery, etc. All these serious crimes were emanating around these sex establishments. That gave us the impetus to go to Albany and get the legislation we need to curb some of these activities. That became a very effective tool. The nuisance abatement law said, in effect, if you had 3 convictions for prostitution in the premises, or if you had a zoning violation where they were operating in contrary to the zoning, or if there were serious building violations, we could go in and padlock.
What were the difficulties that you had to handle?
There were two areas that I'd say that were most difficult. One was overcoming what I call the internal pressures. We were stepping on a lot of people, certain quarters in this city and agencies that were not happy because we put a stop to a lot of their income from bribes. The other one is that when you're dealing with pornography in particular, and there were a lot of porno stores in Midtown at that time, you're dealing with First Amendment rights, the right to free speech. And that's a very delicate balance that you have to draw.
How did the public opinion react to the renewal of Times Square?
A lot of the public officials would always publicly state that we shouldn't waste government resources on enforcing these laws. It's victimless crime, doesn't affect anybody. You shouldn't be concerned with what people want to do sexually or anything else. Plus the press, which was generally not in favor of what we were doing.
Can you tell me what was done after you left?
One person that I think really followed up in getting this done was Rudy Giuliani. When he became mayor, he had the same kind of, shall I say, belief system that I had, that there is an important role for the government in taking care of these nuisances. Times Square is not what it was, fortunately, in the early 1970s. Much the better. And some people think I spoiled all the fun.
Come on, come through New York, New York, New York.
Michelle de Serja, NYFA News, New York.